All right, so I want to talk about the filibuster real quick because the filibuster is something we're going to be hearing over and over and over again in the coming months throughout Joe Biden's administration because what they just used to pass the massive $1.9 trillion COVID relief package was the process of budget reconciliation, which only requires about 51 votes or exactly 51 votes to pass it through. And that's exactly what just happened in the Senate. The Democrats, with a very slim majority, were able to pass it because it was being passed through the process of budget reconciliation. Now, for all other pieces of legislation that are not directly related to the budget, the only other instance that I could think of where you would have a big package that's related to the budget would maybe be something with like infrastructure, a big infrastructure package and spending relating to it in that way. That could maybe be passed through the process of budget reconciliation and only require the 51 votes with Kamala Harris as the president of the Senate. But for all other pieces of legislation, the filibuster is going to be the main key question that's in place because if conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who are the main two who have come out in opposition to abolishing the filibuster, if they maintain that position and hold on to this relic, this Jim Crow relic as it has been called, then it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to pass all of the pieces of Joe Biden's legislation or legislative agenda. Why? Because you're not going to get Republicans to work with you on anything. They're not going to work with you on fuck all, okay? This is exactly what Joe Biden just saw under Obama, when he was with Obama for 8 years. This is exactly what the Republican Party did to them. For example, on Obamacare, Obama made many concessions to conservatives. Obamacare itself came from the Heritage Foundation. It was a conservative policy, a conservative plan, and yet what happened when they went to vote on it? 0 Republicans voted for Obamacare. So, you're never going to get to work with them, even if it's on conservative agendas, even if it's on stuff that's been compromised into oblivion. You're never going to get Republicans to work with you. So you need to abolish the filibuster if you want to get some of these key tenet parts of your platform accomplished. We also just saw these conservatives who are still trying to block the filibuster, block other pieces of legislation, specifically the $15 minimum wage. At the same time that we were seeing Joe Manchin go on all of these media outlets and claim like, oh, well, I'm just working for my conservative constituents in West Virginia. Oh, I'm sorry I couldn't give you the $15 minimum wage. I have to listen to them. I'm really just listening to my constituents. I'm doing my job. Okay, well, at the same time that he was blocking the $15 minimum wage, we saw polls like this, okay? Majority of West Virginians support the $15 minimum wage. It was around 63% of West Virginians supported the $15 minimum wage that Joe Manchin blocked, and then used those constituents as a wall, as an excuse for why he wouldn't have voted for it. Okay, so it's a bullshit excuse for these people to be saying that their constituents don't want some of these bolder progressive agenda items. That's just flat out wrong. Okay, we look at the polling data, we know that they were in favor of the $15 minimum wage, and in a similar capacity, here's Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, who has been historically using or has recently been using her conservative constituency as an excuse to not get rid of the filibuster. So here's what she said. She said, Arizona's, or here's from Vox, Arizonans' perspective on this issue is interesting, giving Sinema's stated opposition to such changes thus far. At the start of this term, she was one of 2 Democrats alongside Joe Manchin, who was opposing abolishing the filibuster. Quote, she is not open to changing her mind about eliminating the filibuster, a Sinema spokesperson told the Washington Post in January. And more recently, Sinema again emphasized that she believed the practice was important to help senators and minority maintain a voice. Quote, regardless of the party in control of the Senate, respecting the opinions of senators from the minority party will result in better common sense legislation. Again, that's complete bullshit. All you have to do is look at what happened under the Obama administration. What happens with the Republican Party is they don't want to give you a political win. They're not going to give you anything, even if you're compromising, even if you're negotiating, even if you're giving up everything. They're not going to give you that win, and they're not going to work alongside you, okay? Unless it's like going to war with some other country or giving a corporate tax break to billionaires, Republicans are not going to work with you on good legislation, okay? That's flat out delusional. But of course, that's her position. And she continues on, my position remains exactly the same now that I serve in the majority. While eliminating the filibuster may result in some short-term legislative gains, it would deepen the partisan divides and sacrifice the long-term health of our government. I would venture to say that our government is not healthy. It hasn't been healthy for a long time. And the Senate is one of the main blockades to the democratic process, one of the main blockades to democracy and what the people want. Specifically things like the filibuster that have historically, if you look at how the filibuster has been used throughout history, it was used to block like original originally major pieces of civil rights legislation. And you see that and contrast that with some bills that have been brought up recently with, like, for example, H.R. 1 that seeks to make like automatic voter registration and expand voting access and increase participation in the democratic process. That is, again, being blocked by something like the filibuster. So you see historical comparisons here between how the filibuster has been used in the past to block civil rights legislation and how it's being used right now to do similar things. So, you know, this is it's still being operated and used in the exact same way, and yet they don't acknowledge this. They think that it's somehow preserving the long-term health of our government. No, it's not preserving the long-term health of our government. Our government is fucking collapsing. It's terrible. Congress has like a 20% approval rating. People hate how our government is functioning right now because it's not functioning because you're not able to pass legislation that's good. You're not able to pass overwhelmingly popular legislation. Why? Because we have blockades like the filibuster. So it's just utter nonsense, this entire statement that she's put out here. But again, even more importantly, what she's saying in that she has to somehow serve her conservative constituents is just flat out wrong. In a February Data for Progress survey, 61% of likely voters in the state said that they favored approving key bills, compared to 26% who think it's more important to preserve traditional Senate procedures and rules like the filibuster. Though the response differed notably across party lines. 76% of Democrats thought approving major legislation was more important, as did 66% of independents, while just 42% of Republicans did. So her own constituents, right? Independents, Democrats, it's overwhelming, 61%, compared to 26% who think that it's more important to preserve the filibuster. So she's basically taking the position of 26% of her constituents and not taking the position of the 61%. So, in other words, she's not fucking serving her constituents, and that's a bullshit excuse that her and Joe Manchin have used, again, similar to how Joe Manchin used that excuse with the $15 minimum wage, even though a majority of his constituents favored that. They're not serving their constituents. Stop letting them get away with this bullshit line. And I mean, mainstream media outlets have run with this as well and pushing this as if it's just default. They don't even ask the question of what their constituents actually believe in and support. They just take it as a default that, oh, well, you're in Arizona, so you must be serving a more conservative constituency. Oh, you're in West Virginia, so they must not want the $15 minimum wage in Virginia. That's just flat out not true. So there's really no excuse to not get rid of this thing. You're not serving your constituents. You don't want to take hard votes. That's basically what it is. Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, they don't want to take these difficult votes on some of these major pieces of legislation. That's what it is. They're cowards. They're not willing to step up to the moment. And so Joe Manchin has gone a little bit further, I guess you could say, than Kyrsten Sinema on this front, saying that he is willing to reform the filibuster, not get rid of it entirely. But this could also be somewhat big as well. Manchin, quote, Manchin can support reforms of the filibuster, make them talk, etc., while removing the 60-vote threshold for a final vote, and still say that he did not end the filibuster. The Intercept's Ryan Grimm tweeted in response to the West Virginia Democrats' comments, hard to overstate how big it is. So basically, Manchin said, if you want to make it a little bit more painful, make him stand there and talk. I'm willing to look at any way we can, but I'm not willing to take away the involvement of minorities. So basically, Joe Manchin is saying, I'm not willing to entirely get rid of the filibuster, but I'll reform it and make it so that basically if you're going to filibuster, you got to do it how they used to do it, right? Again, when they were blocking major pieces of civil rights legislation, he's saying, well, you got to use it how they were using then, and you actually have to stand up and occupy that space and speak for the entirety that you're trying to filibuster. Because basically the way that it rules right now, you can just like send an email to filibuster right now. You don't have to actually do anything. So it's purely an obstructionist way that a 41 Senate minority can block massively popular pieces of legislation that are supported by the vast majority of the country, and they don't even have to put in any fucking effort. So at least, I mean, I guess if you want to take a minor step in the right direction, it's like taking 5 steps when you need to be going the entire length of the football field. But at least in that way, you would be able to say, well, okay, then fucking make these Republicans who are going to block this legislation, make them stand up there and stall, make them stand up there and speak and explain to the voters why they're standing in the way of overwhelmingly popular legislation. So I do see the utility in that. I see how that could be better than not making any changes whatsoever, but still, again, this is a relic of the Jim Crow era. This historically has been used to block major pieces of legislation that are good for the American people, that are good for the working class, that are good for minorities in this country, and now that's how it's being used again. So there's no excuse. it's not because of your conservative constituents. It's because you are cowards and you don't want to have to vote on these important pieces of legislation that need to be voted on. So there's no excuse for it. Put some pressure on these people, conservatives like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. You got to get them to fall in line. Biden recently came out a couple of days ago and said that he wasn't even sure that he wanted to abolish the filibuster. So listen, this is going to be a defining point right here. If they want to take on the fight and actually legitimately abolish the filibuster, then you're going to be able to get some shit done. But guess what? Democrats don't necessarily want to get some of this shit done. A lot of it, they're kind of just grandstanding and acting as if they support it. But then when it comes down to it, they don't actually want to fight for it. So we'll see how far they're willing to go on the filibuster. I'm not entirely confident that they're going to abolish it. In fact, I'm very almost certain that they're not going to end up abolishing it. But whether or not they can get some of these reforms is going to be a different question. But this is extremely important. It's going to be really telling whether or not the Democrats are going to be able to do this, because it'll tell you whether or not they actually care about passing some of the major key points of their own legislative agenda.